Now, in the run-up to the invasion, Secretary of State Colin Powell had privately warned President Bush that occupying Iraq might pose difficulties. In what became known as the Pottery Barn Rule, he told the president that if you break it, you own it. What became clear as the spring of 2003 turned to summer was this: the United States now owned a broken Iraq, but didn't know what to do with it. Although the fighting had supposedly ended, American combat casualties continued to mount. An indicator of just how broken Iraq was and how unprepared U.S. forces were for the responsibilities they now faced was the increase in U.S. military fatalities. Already by the end of August 2003, more American soldiers had been killed after mission accomplished than were killed during the actual invasion. And this was just for starters. Each month, dozens of additional GIs were shipped home in caskets.
Who were they fighting? I mean, Saddam's army was gone, so who was the enemy?
Few Iraqis mourned the downfall of Saddam Hussein, but equally few welcomed a U.S. military occupation. Cells of resistance fighters began forming even before U.S. forces reached Baghdad. In 2003, before sectarian conflict had begun, Sunnis and Shiites banded together to take up arms against the American occupation. These early alliances began to break down, however, as Iraq's many internal problems erupted after long suppression by Saddam Hussein. Iraq's Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds fought among each other for the future spoils of Iraq free from Saddam, while a resistance to the U.S. occupation arose, expanded, and evolved. Internal divisions among Iraqi factions and an energized base of Sunnis hailing bin Laden as a hero allowed the Iraqi resistance movement to become dominated by fighters drawing inspiration from al-Qaeda. The terrorist movement the Bush administration hoped to sweep up suddenly had a new seedbed in the heart of the Middle East.
Please explain.
Well, the U.S. occupation of Iraq outraged Islamists beyond Iraq. Even before the start of what he called the Crusader War, Osama bin Laden urged his followers to go to Iraq. All Muslims have to begin jihad against this unjust war, he urged. In response, so-called foreign fighters were soon converging on Iraq to attack Americans. In Saddam's Iraq, there had been no al-Qaeda presence. With Saddam's removal, that country became, as it remains to this day, an al-Qaeda hotbed.
Where do these foreign fighters come from?
From all over the place. Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Iran, Palestine, even from Europe. But by far the largest number came from Saudi Arabia, the country 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers called home. To be sure, the number of foreign fighters in Iraq at any time during the U.S. occupation was small compared to the number of Iraqis involved in the resistance. The overwhelming majority of fighters who took up arms against the American occupation were Iraqi. The ideas, mindset, and mentality the foreign fighters brought to Iraq were more important than their actual numbers. They changed the nature of the insurgency, even though they played a small role on the battlefield. Largely because of the foreign fighters, the insurgency morphed from a largely non-sectarian nationalist movement into a virulent Sunni bloodlust campaign targeting U.S. forces and Shiite communities alike.
How did the U.S. respond?
It improvised. Remember, before going into Iraq, policymakers hadn't taken seriously Powell's Pottery Barn Rule. They had not adequately planned for how to put together the country that they set out to break. Complicating this problem was Rumsfeld's insistence on limiting the number of troops available. Unless the local population is compliant, military occupation is soldier-intensive work. Well, Iraqis weren't compliant, and the U.S. found itself with too few soldiers on the ground. Militarily, improvisation translated into a heavy-handed effort to lock up every suspected or would-be insurgent. Break down doors, detain the young men, throw them in jail. That was the basic approach. Politically, improvisation translated into a crash effort to create an Iraqi government that would govern Iraq in ways that suited the interests of the United States. Responsible for the military piece was Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez. General Tommy Franks, of course, had gotten out when the getting was good. The Army's junior-most three-star general, Sanchez needed lots of help, but didn't get it. He was out of his depth. The advanced intermediate swimmer suddenly ordered to make it across the English Channel. Responsible for the political piece was L. Paul Bremer, known as Jerry. Bremer was a former diplomat, well regarded in Washington circles, now anointed as America's viceroy in Baghdad. As he took up his post, Bremer seemed to think that he had a completely free hand to do whatever he wanted to do. He also seemed to fancy that he was Douglas MacArthur ruling post-war Japan. So upon arriving in Iraq, he immediately disbanded what remained of the Iraqi army and prohibited any and all members of the Ba'ath Party from playing any role in Iraqi public life. The effect of both actions was to provide Iraqi recruits for the insurgency.
Not exactly a dream team to lead the big sweep.
Well, they weren't any kind of team. Sanchez and Bremer loathed one another. They barely spoke. And that was yet another factor that undermined U.S. occupation efforts.
So what did Sanchez and Bremer achieve?
Sadly, not much. On Sanchez's watch, U.S. troops captured Saddam Hussein and took Saddam's truly evil sons permanently out of circulation. Far overshadowing these achievements was the breaking of the Abu Ghraib scandal. We'll talk more about Abu Ghraib in a future lesson, but suffice it to say here that it destroyed whatever remained of the American liberation narrative. Overall, the level of violence in Iraq mushroomed, with U.S. forces seemingly clueless about how to assert control. As for Bremer, he did oversee the creation of a new Iraqi political order. On June 28, 2004, Bremer handed the reins of government to Ayad Allawi, chosen by Washington to lead the new Iraq. Unfortunately, the reins came without either horses or buggy. Back in Washington, Condoleezza Rice, the White House National Security Advisor, handed President Bush a note reading, "Iraq is sovereign." Bush grabbed a pen and scrawled, "Let freedom ring." In fact, Iraq was a basket case, a dysfunctional dependency mired in savagery. Several months earlier, Donald Rumsfeld had penned a famous memo in which he posed this question: are we capturing, killing, or deterring and dissuading more terrorists every day than the madrasas and the radical clerics are recruiting, training, and deploying against us? With regard to Iraq, the answer to Rumsfeld's question was clearly no. U.S. military efforts were inciting resistance rather than reducing it.
So who succeeded Sanchez and Bremer in Baghdad?
Generals and diplomats who will remain nameless in honor of the negligible impact that they made. Here's what you need to know. In 2005 and 2006, conditions in Iraq went from bad to worse. Bush and Rumsfeld did a bad imitation of Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara during Vietnam, insisting that there was light at the end of the tunnel. As is so often the case, it took a political earthquake at home to shake Bush out of his stupor. The November 2006 off-year elections were to some degree a referendum on the war. The Democrats won big, gaining control of both houses of Congress. And in Iraq, Bush finally decided to change course.